Morals in Man, Part 7. The ingenuity which has created the machine age could be used to create a Christian machine age. A right criterion, a right direction of invention and enterprise, these are what is needed. A positive, not a negative program. The safeguarding and perfecting of the creative faculty in man, in every man, is the Christian criterion. And with this, the machinery is not necessarily incompatible. It can increase, not destroy, creativity. The town building, which is, or rather would be, possible with the aid of rationalized machinery, implies greater creativity than the building of the agglomerate of huts which is possible without it. We should not scorn the possibilities of urban civilization simply because our towns are, in fact, so frightful, because the word urban has sunk to such ignominy that we have to add an E to make it polite. It is essential, and it is possible, to have a machinery, which both in the making and in the use of does not imply subhuman service from man, which does not usurp what the hand can be better do and ought to do, which helps the hand to do what without it could not. At present, man is still working to a great extent being made to do the dirty work of the machine. Instead of this, the machine should be made to do the dirty work of man. In the same way, the vast resources of power which are now at our disposal should be used not to destroy, but to safeguard or to recreate the ideals of small ownership and enterprise. A society in which a man cannot call his house or his work his own is on the way to becoming a society in which man cannot call his soul his own. St. Thomas teaches, as we know, that on the one hand, primarily in view of the exigencies of the human personality considered as working on and elaborating material and subjecting it to the forms of reason, the appropriation of goods should be private, since otherwise labor would be ill exercised. But on the other hand, in view of the primary destination of material goods to the benefiting of the human race, and the need each person has of these means in order to direct his life towards his last end, the use of goods privately possessed should serve the common good of all. This second aspect was completely lost sight of the epoch of liberalist individualism. The socialist or communist reaction, however, is no remedy to this neglect, for again, like most revolutionary doctrines, it tries to redeem one aspect of the truth by suppressing the other. Precisely in order to extend to each individual in suitable form the advantages and guarantees with which private property endows the personality. It is not a form of state socialism or communism, but, in our view, a form of partnership that property should take in the sphere of industrialism, so that joint ownership should replace as far as possible the wage system, and the human person should be compensated for the conditions imposed by machinery, by the intellectual participation of labor in the birth and direction of enterprise. The working out of this idea cannot be followed here, but the basic principle may again be recalled. We should not strive to recreate a dead past. In the economics of industry, the very interests of the personality demand a certain collectivization of ownership. The more enterprise is perfected by machinery, rationalization, and the means of financial mobility, the more extenuated becomes this tendency to collectivism. On the other hand, rural economy, under modern forms and utilizing the advantages of machinery and cooperation, would tend towards a renewal and a vivifying of family economy and family ownership, And it is this rural economy, more fundamental than industry, which should first be assured. Again, the distribution of enterprise and ownership should be accompanied by a parallel distribution of political responsibility. Bureaucracy, unless it is opposed, will complete the dehumanization which the economic regime, basking in the laissez-faire atmosphere of liberal democracy, so successfully began. Again, a positive program is essential, and of this, one element must surely be a large measure of devolution. How can a village, let alone a district, hold up its head when its life, its mores, its housing, and even its carousing are controlled from Whitehall? Education, for example, has certainly lost far more than it has gained by centralization. The contemplation natural to the peasant is practically a thing of the past. In its stead, the child is given a mass of material information, some of which may enable the man to read the popular press, do accounts, and know the geographical position of Birmingham and Blackpool. We are, in other words, doing our best to produce the kind of public which falls an easy prey to the commercialism, sensationalism, and vulgar thought surrogates supplied by the popular press or radio. Once again, we should not advocate the abandonment of education because, like machinery, it would seem so far to have proved almost more of a curse than a blessing, but we ought surely to be urgent in working for its improvement, for the creation of an order in which the child's faculty of vision shall not be killed but perfected, the educational environment beautiful instead of ugly, its technique not mechanical but personal, a matter not of arid regimentation but of fertile individual care and initiative. Whatever form of government may be in question, it is the establishment of democracy in the true sense of the word that the new Christendom must aim, a democratie personaliste, compatible indeed with organic differentiations and inequalities, yet preserving as first condition of its structure the dignity and autonomy of the person. Then law would find once again its moral function, the function of pedagogue of freedom, which it has all but lost in the liberal state. It would concern itself with the education of men to the end that they might cease to last to be under the law, for they would then do it of themselves, voluntarily and freely, what the law prescribes, a thing that happens only to the wise. In all these different parts of the integrationist program, the same fundamental ideas are dominant. The important thing, the thing which must always be put first and in the light of which other considerations must be weighed, is the human personality. We are threatened with the dissolution of our world because we have done violence to personality, whether in the name of commercial efficiency or in the name of state absolutism, or simply through the haphazard growth to gigantic proportions of bureaucracy. There are more important things than political or economic efficiency, and they must be put first. But this must be done, not by destroying everything else, but by perfecting everything else, not by jettisoning our heritage, the good with the bad, but by trying so to alter that, by serving instead of betraying the first things, it may itself become wholly good. A bold program, perhaps dangerous, yet we are bound to attempt it if we would not run counter to the basic Thomist principle by abandoning the actual or potential achievements of our world and thereby destroying some part of the human existence. And we should neither fight shy of attempting it, nor despair of success if we put our trust, as we ought, in Him who makes all things new. Chapter 8. Politics and Personalism. Among politicians, said Whichcote, the Cambridge Platonist, the esteem of religion is profitable, the principles of it are troublesome. Having the principle of it, any business there at all. The Middle Ages were emphatic and, with the exception of Occam and Marsiglio of Padua, unanimous in their answer. The Aristotelian notion of political society as condition of the good life, based upon the principle that man is a social animal, has been reinforced and transfigured by the Christian principle of membership of Christ's mystical body, and the consequent portrayal by Augustine in the City of God. A society at once natural and supernaturalized. This, in turn, had given rise to the doctrine of the primacy of the spiritual, the end of man being first beatitude in the next life, and secondly, beatitude in this, the principles according to which the primary object was to be achieved were regarded as superior to and regulative of the principles which concern the secondary. Thus it might be expedient economically for a king to levy a tax or to wage a war, but such expediency would have to be foregone if the spiritual authority declared his projects ethically wrong, irreconcilable with the Spirit of Christ. Such was the theory. In practice, as A.D. Lindsay, for example, pointed out in his Christianity and Economics, by the time of the Reformation, the subordination had to a great extent ceased to exist. Ethical principles continued to be preached from the pulpit. The laity in practice ignored them. After the Reformation, the split widened. Luther violently attacked social evils, but the weapons he used were those of the medieval canonist, which he himself in his contempt for learning and reason denounced with equal violence. And he had no positive program to suggest, for indeed his basic principle was that to externalize religion in rules of conduct was to degrade it. Of Calvin, the same is not true. The principle upon which the collectivization of Geneva rested may be described as that of the omnicompetent church, but Calvinism developed individualistically in spite of Calvin, and the theory that thrifty business was a virtuous conduct developed into the Puritan doctrine of the sanctity of wealth. Thus, the divorce of religion from life was completed either on the explicit ground that the former had nothing to do with the latter, or because religion itself was made to give its blessing to the get-rich-quick policy of commerce. The Reformation, in this and other matters, was not a violent break with tradition, forced upon a society and spirit thoroughly Christian. It was the logical conclusion of a settled tendency. That conclusion has its classical formulation in the words of Tawney. Society ceases to be an organism, a communion of classes with varying interests, united by mutual obligations arising from their relations to a common end, and by the recognition of common supra-political and supra-economic criteria and authority, and becomes instead a joint stock company in which the liabilities of the shareholders are strictly limited. The functional idea of society had collapsed. The way was open to laissez-faire in economics and to liberalist individualism in politics. The philosophical spokesman of the joint stock company was Locke, but the divorce of politics from ethics have taken place much earlier. A fundamental principle in Machiavelli. It appeared in England in the Leviathan. The premises upon which Hobbes based his political theory are the principles, first, of psychological hedonism. Pleasure is the only good, and men, in fact, always pursue it. And secondly, of egoism, of the voluntary acts of every man, the object is some good to himself. Political society is by convention established solely for the utility of the individuals. By nature solitary, man in the natural state is always at war with the world, and life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It is only when egoism recognizes the need of society for the sake of peace and commodious living and the avoidance of an untimely death that reason suggests the renouncing of natural rights by a mutual agreement, the observance of which is a rule of reason or law of nature. This surrender of rights is, with the exception of the right of self-preservation, absolute. The original compact of union is made between the citizens, not between the subjects and their ruler. To seek peace, then, is the first law of nature, as Hobbes used the term. From this follows a second, that men must be ready, in pursuit of this end, to lay down their rights to all things, if other men will do likewise, and from this again follows the third, that men must perform their covenants made. Here Hobbes allows of no condition. The law is absolute, and with some sleight of hand he introduces the word ought, quite illegitimately. Unjust and wrong, wrong and right, in this order, the theological pessimism of Luther is paralleled in the ethical pessimism of Hobbes, now have meaning, for injustice is the infringement of a covenant once made. The king, then, can do no wrong, Hobbes here agreeing with the upholders of the theory of divine right, for he has made no covenant. He cannot forfeit his power. His laws may not be disobeyed simply because the subjects think them unjust. To these theorizings, the Revolution offered a Johnsonian refutation. It remained to formulate the justification of the triumph of parliamentarism, to abolish the absolutism of the king, to give full scope to individualism. To this task, Locke addressed himself. He retained the social contract theory, but he changed its nature. By it, the individuals cede the anarchic powers of the state of nature into the hands not of the king, but of the community. If they keep their individual liberty, and the state engages itself by a constitutional pact to respect and maintain them, there is no thought of a common end of society. Men merely seek in it the security necessary for the attainment of their own individual ends. Thus, in place of the absolution of the sovereign of Hobbes, Locke substitutes, as Vialito remarks, the absolutism of the individual, and in place of the principle of functional responsibility, the principle of non-interference on the part of the state and of individual irresponsibility on the part of the citizen. It was the fall of the papacy in England that founded the Whig aristocracy, wrote Disraeli in Coningsby. The kingship, made economically impotent after the 17th century, became successively weaker. The royal prerogative, unfortunately for the rights and liberties and social welfare of the people, has, since 1688, been more or less oppressed. The Church, resigned to its new position of adjunct to the gentry and became stagnant, exercised no control whatever. The majority rule, which Locke had recognized as a practical necessity for the working of democracy, was in fact used as an electioneering slogan for the purpose of oligarchy. The people were cheated into the 1832 reform. Small wonder there was nearly a revolution when they discovered how they had been tricked. The power passed exclusively into the hands of a single class. The Tory rule had not been particularly intelligent. It had at least been kind. The Whig regime was both unintelligent and spiteful. Significantly, it regarded poverty as a crime. The workhouse test was made as humiliatingly as possible. The Negro slavery agitation was largely humbug, an electioneering device. Nothing was done to remedy slavery in England itself. Class warfare was inevitable, the terrible anomaly of the two nations. This political issue, combined with the economic evils of industrial and financial capitalism, produced a reaction in political theory, the renewal of absolutism. Democracy has failed, it was claimed. Totalitarianism must be tried as a better alternative. The theory of the absolute state has often enough been formulated from the Republic onwards. Spencer's organism theory, the individual occupying the position of a cell in a physical organism, should logically leave no scope for individual liberty or personality. Hegel regarded political society as an aspect of the absolute evolving towards its own perfection and therefore as having as its one end its own subsistence. Modern forms of totalitarianism tend to deny all the natural rights of individuals and to assert the complete transcendence of the interests of the state. As with other philosophical alternatives, Thomism contrives to occupy, between individualism and totalitarianism, a middle position by way not of eclecticism, but of synthesis. When considering ethical theories, we found that the philosophy of St. Thomas had something in common with them all. Here, similarly, it is by a fusion of opposing elements that this synthesis is achieved. Man is by nature a social animal, and this is the basic principle of the Thomist theory. Political society, therefore, is indicated by nature not only as a means of security and material welfare, but also as an indispensable means to the positive attainment of the best life. The man who lives in isolation, as Aristotle remarked, is either subhuman or superhuman. If, then, to live in a society is demanded by the end of human nature, it is a matter of moral obligation, for physical necessity with regard to the achievement of the natural end becomes in man an ethical imperative. The theory of a free contract, therefore, is not in se acceptable. What is the acceptable element in it? Simply this, that while political society in general is of natural law, the particular form in which this or that society can theoretically be a matter of agreement and will indeed necessarily differ according to a divergent racial temperaments and characteristics, a fact sometimes overlooked by empire builders. Secondly, if the social life is a necessary condition of the good life, it follows, as we have seen, that in some respects the society exists for the sake of the individual, but not in all respects. The common good, according to Aristotle and St. Thomas, is more divine than the particular good of each individual, inasmuch as the good of the whole takes precedence over that of the part. Aristotle's hylomorphism is here applied. The individuals are in one respect the materials of the state, as bricks are of a house, and the end of the community is therefore greater than the sum of the ends of its parts, as that of the house is greater than the sum of the ends of the bricks. It is a man's duty, therefore, to act for the common good, the building up of a good social life, a good city, let us say, harmoniously functioning as an organism, each part perfect in its proper function. Each part perfect, in theory, the common good includes all the individual goods. In practice it is otherwise, for men do not act consistently according to reason, and a state of tension inevitably results, which makes it necessary to delimit the rights and make plain the duties of citizen and state. Moreover, the common good is not a fixed thing. It varies according to circumstance, and in time of crisis the good of the individual must be sacrificed for the preservation of the whole society. But men are not merely parts of a whole, cogs in a machine. They are self-subsistent, rational. They have personality and a capacity for and natural orientation towards the contemplation of the truth. As persons, they are not parts of a whole, but sui juris. They stand alone. As contemplative, they have a perfection to achieve which is personal to themselves, and it is in the achieving of this perfection that the good life principally lies. Society, then, in its turn, has a twofold obligation. It cannot interfere with this private and personal end. It must, on the contrary, foster it by providing the proper material setting for it. The starving man cannot contemplate, nor can the man who is overactive. Contemplation demands a certain degree of wealth and leisure. And what of sovereignty? It is clear that all cannot govern all. The power must be vested in somebody. A priori, and in theory, according to St. Thomas, monarchy is the most perfect form of government, but he is too realist to leave the matter there. He was not familiar with courts for nothing. In practice, he holds, the regime most likely to succeed is a limited monarchy, for this provides the most efficient check on attempts at abuse of power. It will be seen that the Thomist politic agrees with some extent with all the varying theories of the state. With Spencer, it holds that the state is an organism, though it refuses to allow that individuals are no more than cells in the organism. The principle of functional society emerges. With Plato's Republic and all forms of communism and collectivism, it holds that the end of the society is greater than the ends of the individuals who compose it, while refusing to admit that the state is omnicompetent and supreme. The principle of social ethic emerges. Even with Hegel's pantheism, it has this affinity, that it views the evolution of the society as a process of divinization, the working out of the divine idea in the material of human relationship. The principle of common striving after the bonum commune emerges. With the Contrat social of Rousseau, it has this much in common, that while denying the thesis that society is the outcome merely of convention and of the pseudo-mystic deification, political pantheism, of the general will, it can be seen that the latter postulate the truth that there ought to be a general will, if not in the sense understood by Bosanquet as a real or higher, as opposed to apparent or lower satisfaction of individual wills. Rousseau was not as subtle as this, at least in the sense of a striving after a common objective more divine than that of the will of each. With Hobbes and Locke, it holds that the state must protect and safeguard the citizen's perfection, but it will not narrow the scope of state action to this negative policy that Bosanquet calls the hindering of hindrances alone. On the contrary, to the principle of non-interference with the personal end of the individual and of the safeguarding of individual rights, it adds the positive duty on the part of the state of fostering actively the individual's perfection by assuring him the material environment necessary for achieving. The same is true with the contemporary alternatives. Thomism is fundamentally opposed to totalitarianism in its denial of personal end and rights, though at one with its search for unity and a common goal. It is fundamentally opposed to individualism on the grounds of its social irresponsibility, its denial of the supremacy of moral law and of the rights of the society against the individual, but at one with its assertion of the validity of personal ends. It denies totally the omnicompetence of the state, but welcomes any political structure which expresses its two basic principles of personalism and of social function. On the one hand, it sees society as an organism wherein each member has its function and therefore his duties to the whole community. Duties which, as the bonum commune varies, for it will be very different thing in time of prosperous peace and in time of war or famine, will demand more or less sacrifice and make possible to a greater or lesser degree the identification of the individual perfection with that of the whole. On the other hand, the citizens are persons, and society, therefore, as a whole, has the duty of respecting, safeguarding, and positively promoting the personal good of each citizen. And as these mutual responsibilities are dictated not by utilitarian agreement but by natural law, the demands of human nature as such, their sanction is a moral sanction. The citizen is morally bound to further the interests of society, the state to further the interests of the person. The same is true of the relationship of state to state. Thomism cannot accept the international irresponsibility of a nationalism which admits no law above that of its own interest, nor the anti-national irresponsibility of cosmopolitanism, which refuses to regard the nation as a unit at all. There must be international relations of states as there are social relationships of individuals, and for similar reasons, these relationships in their turn must conform to ethical criteria. To this philosophical conception of society, Christianity brings clarification and profundity. The Christian law of justice goes far beyond the natural law of justice. The supernatural end of man enlarges the ambit of private endeavor, imposes on the state a far greater degree of non-interference, and at the same time, by imposing on it the duty of subserving a supernatural end, providing material scope for the living of the supernatural life, enlarges its duties and responsibilities. The doctrine of the mystical body gives new and profound meaning to the Aristotelian principle that the common good is more divine than the particular. The end now envisaged is that of a society working not merely for the terrestrial beatitude of individuals and the advancement of society as a whole, but for the celestial good of all and the divinization, the supernaturalized civilization of the whole. It is easy to think of the regulating hand of theology and politics in terms of sinister ecclesiastics lurking lugubriously behind the curtains of medieval thrones. History affords some excuse for such a view, but it should not blind us to the theoretical truth implicit in Plato's picture of the philosopher king. That a science whose concern is with a single aspect of life is of itself insufficient to regulate actions which affect the whole of life. The evil of a disgregate life and the individual results of a lack of unity of thought, and as a functional political structure postulates hierarchy, and a functional internationalism demands unity of aim, so there must first be a contemplative coherence, a clear apprehension of the end to be achieved and of the duties of individuals and of society in bringing it about. To make politics supreme is to sacrifice the whole man for the sake of an abstraction. To divorce politics from ethics is to throw man into chaos and disruption. The two great evils which threaten human society today are, on the one hand, a progressive subhumanization, and on the other hand, sudden and perhaps total destruction through nuclear warfare. The absolutist state forces subhumanity among its subjects by treating them as cogs in the political machine. The liberalist state by developing into a plutocratic oligarchy or an impersonal and anti-personalist bureaucracy, brings about the same result in a more underhand fashion. Subhumanity will not be remedied by partial expedients, any more than international chaos will be cured simply by talking of peace. We are suffering from a double disorder. Political leadership is both too centralized and too localized. In former times, writes Professor Ferrero, the world was divided into many independent sections. Empires might fall to rack and ruin in the Far East without the Mediterranean era being aware of it. The Mediterranean era might sink into anarchy without unduly upsetting distant Asia. Nowadays, the world lives a single coordinated life despite diversity of races and climates, religions and customs. The internal happenings of other countries are of no concern of ours, diplomats like to say. This formula might have had value behind the closed doors of chancelleries. Dragged out into the open air of reality, it has none. On the contrary, it could be said that nothing concerns every people more than do the political crisis and coups d'etat and revolutions which are capable of shaking the foundations of the social order in one part or another of the earth. Isolated destinies no longer exist among the nations. The solidarity of the world is a fact from which we cannot escape if we could, and we ought not to want to escape from it, for to the Christian it expresses a realization of the ideal of human family. But our trouble is that we have had a material unity brought about for us, and we are not prepared to use it properly, to make it also a formal unity. The unification of the world, accomplished by colonization, by exploration, by emigration, by universal religions, by wars, by commerce, diplomacy, railroads, and telegraphic communication, must lead to a civilization of a universal character. A single body cannot go on living under the guidance of several discordant and inimical consciences. The world body, which is now almost a physical entity, requires a single conscience in which there will be room for all that is best of the civilizations already existing to reside in harmony. Christian morality, Occidental industry and science, the ancient wisdom of the East, the flower of European and Asiatic art. This unity of conscience is precisely what we lack. We have therefore all the dangers of solidarity and a few of its blessings. When we have the opportunity to secure world unity and peace, we cannot use it, because politicians continue to look after the vital interests of their own nations to the detriment of the really vital interests of others. The element of centralization necessary to preserve our world is one thing we cannot achieve in a world suffering from over-centralization, because we have not yet learned the lesson that nationalism, implying as it does the impossibility of establishing a single conscience, is the curse of the world. On the other hand, at home we find ourselves the victims of the opposite evil. It is a part of the perfection of every man that he should be able to rule his own roost. In fact, we find the state encroaching more and more upon the autonomy of the individual and the family, In England, our private lives are increasingly at the mercy of Whitehall. We find ourselves more and more marshaled like children and subjected to a dragooning, which is a practical denial of the rights of the person, and will lead to a state of affairs in which the citizen becomes incapable of exercising his citizenship. For if a faculty is robbed long enough of its function, it becomes atrophied. Man has a spiritual and immortal soul. He is a person, marvelously endowed by his Creator with gifts of body and mind. He is a true microcosm, as the ancients said, a world in miniature, with a value far surpassing that of the vast inanimate cosmos. God alone in his last end, in the life and the next. By sanctifying grace, he is raised to the dignity of a Son of God and incorporated into the kingdom of God by the mystical body of Christ. In consequence, he has been endowed by God with many and varied prerogatives, the right to live, to bodily integrity, and to necessary means of existence, the right to tend towards his ultimate goal in the path marked out for him by God, the right of association and the right to possess and use property. God has likewise destined man for the civil society, according to the dictates of his very nature. In the plan of the Creator, society is a natural means which man can and must use to reach his destined end. Society is for man and not vice versa. This must not be understood in the sense of liberalistic individualism, which subordinates society to the selfish use of the individual, but only in the sense that by means of an organic union with society and by mutual collaboration, the attainment of earthly happiness is placed within the reach of all. In the further sense, it is a society which affords the opportunities of the development of the individual and social gifts bestowed on human nature. These gifts have a value surpassing the immediate interests of the moment, for in society they reflect the divine perfection, which would not be true were man to live alone. But on the final analysis, even the latter function, society is made for man, that he may recognize his reflection of God's perfection and refer it in praise and adoration to the Creator. Only man, the human person, and not society in any form, is endowed with reason and a morally free will. We in this country have much to be thankful for. We have not yet reached the stage at which the state is deified. We do not have to conform our thoughts, even our words, to the political gospel of our leaders. Better a bureaucracy than a dictatorship. But we should be on our guard. We have muddled through many things. We have muddled into our present system. We may, if we are not careful, find that we have muddled into something approaching an equivalent totalitarianism. We have to restore the sense of power to the individual, and our only way of doing so is to check the centralization which is oppressing our freedom, and to embark on the opposite policy of devolution. It may be efficient to have everything regulated from Whitehall, but it is inhuman and therefore bad ethics. And a political system, however efficient, cannot be good if it clashes with ethics. We have to work for the restoration of local autonomy. There are things in which centralized control is necessary and beneficent, but there is a vast multitude of things in which it is unnecessary and derogatory to human freedom and responsibility. Let us have centralized control, but let us have our own first concern, in Disraeli's words, that parochial polity of the country which secures to every laborer a home, and, he might have added, a safeguard and a setting for the increase of his soul.